Welcome to The Pictures Get Smaller. My name is Adam O'Conaghy and I'm the producer of this show. The things you will hear over the next hour or so represent the views of The Pictures Get Smaller and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio and are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So, good evening, true believers, and welcome to The Pictures Get Smaller. I'm Adam O'Conaghy, and I'm joined by the amazing Justin Shoemaker and the uncanny Katie Morrissey. Tonight, we're covering superhero movies. In particular, our focus is on the big-budget comic book adaptations that recently have been highly lucrative, and also which have, in some cases, grown in critical praise over the past decade or so. When I began chatting with Katie and Justin about this topic, I proposed that the last decade plus of comic book adaptations, perhaps beginning with X-Men from 2000, were exemplary of a new moment for such films, a new mask of marketing and representing within these films. At the same time, I suggested this recent cycle could trace its origins to Superman from 1978 and Batman from 1989. Katie and Justin were a bit skeptical about my thoughts, so we decided to form a tenuous alliance and team up today in a major crossover event to tackle this subject. So, as we begin, I'm curious, Katie, Justin, what are your thoughts here on the current prominence of the superhero film? What are your thoughts on why it's so massive, so lucrative, such a big, ticket-selling phenomenon? And do you see potential predecessors or points of inspiration, as I do? Or do you think it's just the latest in a sort of ongoing and long-lasting lineage of superhero films? We can sort of start anywhere.
I don't know what happened in 2000 that made this genre just explode with such massive success over the last 12 years or so. I still don't understand it. I'm amazed, and I hope it never goes away because I love comic books. So I just, I'm glad it's here. I hope it never goes away. I hope we don't have that moment like we did in the 90s where too much money went into them and not enough money came out and we had to stop for a few years.
Yeah. But you would say then that there's something significant
Something's
about
happening
this time.
right now.
Okay.
I just don't know what.
Well, I would argue that I don't necessarily think that something has, that superhero movies have somehow, radically appeared in a new way. I would argue that instead other movies have dropped out and there's been a change in production in terms of a new focus and emphasis on the superhero movie. But I think that superhero movies have been around, like you said, since Superman and even earlier than that. So there's been an ongoing interest in creating those kind of franchises. I just think that post-2000 there's a shift in marketing in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And a real focus on superhero movies for their money and a less of a broader mix of blockbusters.
Mm-hmm. So we had some previous big money-making films in the superhero vein. But, I think maybe one other newish development along this time is the rise of Marvel's superhero films, right? Marvel historically had problems getting projects developed. They had many that just bombed out, went straight to video, such as the Captain America film from 1990, the unreleased Fantastic Four film made in the early 90s.
You can see that.
You can see it, yes. But it was, again, mainly made just so they could retain the rights to make a better film, presumably. Although some people say that one's far more charming than the recent installments. But anyway, so maybe there's something about Marvel finally getting its act together in terms of marketing and developing these projects.
Well, there's a couple things we can do with Marvel. One, it starts with how they protected their rights recently with this development of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is the Iron Man, Thor, Captain America triumvirate plus Avengers. But there's also all the franchises that they let go to other production studios like Daredevil, like Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
That they have now sort of begun to relapse back into Marvel's control, and it's going to be interesting to see what they do with those properties.
Well, and the other problem you have with DC is it's a bit more of a one-trick pony. They've done Superman, they've done Batman, but they've kind of stopped with that. And with Marvel, you have the whole kind of Avengers franchise that just keeps going and going and going.
Well, and then there's also the sort of the split between the two universes where DC exists in allegorical versions of our American cities and
Yeah.
Marvel
Right.
exists in actual versions
Yeah.
of our American cities.
That's true. What are some of those cities? Just
Gotham City, Metropolis, Star City, Crescent City.
Yeah.
for DC, these
For
but
DC.
obviously, but what are the real cities that
The-
Marvel
you know,
characters occupy?
New York, Chicago. Most of their stuff always seems to take place in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a big East Coast bias with Marvel.
That's true, and I remember, in fact, with the first Spider-Man film, its New York setting was really emphasized, right? Because the film was released just after September 11th.
Yeah.
They did some reshoots to omit scenes with the World Trade Center, and then, but then they still added like this moment in which regular New Yorkers came together to support Spider-Man, and that sort of permeated the entire franchise to some degree.
To be fair to Marvel, I'm not as much a Marvel girl, so I'm kind of trying to remember what their settings are. But don't they have a set of like regional Avengers too?
Yeah,
So-
and then they also have like Great Britain Avengers and Canada Avengers.
Yeah. The Justice League once had Justice League Europe, I
Yeah.
believe, for the DC universe. But DC is now trying to follow this model of Marvel films, right? That they're trying to get some sort of Justice League project going in which they have films tie in together to build to a big crossover, and then
Yeah,
Continue.
But are they trying to do that? Where
Yes.
are they at in that project?
they're pitching to directors.
Okay.
It's not going well.
Yeah.
The thing is that
do you know some of the early scripts that have come out?
well, I knew about the project with George Miller. I think the guy who did Happy Feet.
Okay.
That one almost got off the ground, but then everybody bailed at the last minute. I think it was part to do with the writer strike, part to do with budget. They tried to pitch to Ben Affleck. He passed. Shocker. And now I think it's sort of in limbo. I mean, that's what they want to do with the next phase of Batman specifically. They want
Yeah.
to use Justice League, introduce a new guy playing Batman, and then tell more Batman stories. But you clearly see a shift where they're going
A more
from...
bright, shiny Batman, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Less
they
grim
wanted
than
to
Christopher
do that
Nolan.
Batman Superman crossover movie that kept failing.
Yeah.
And they ditched it for the new Superman film. So I wonder if that's kind of in the works for something after this new Superman movie.
I don't know, because to me, DC seems to be doing this sort of like, let's do an auteur model for our superheroes, because we
Yeah.
clearly have Nolan, we have Tim Burton,
Yeah.
we have Richard Donner, and then we have the Zack Snyder project, which...
Zack Snyder auteur.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, think about that for a while.
Although, in fairness, Marvel has been somewhat similar. I mean, maybe Hollywood auteurs might be the right word,
Yeah.
but Bryan Singer did the first two X-Men films. He came from this pedigree of The Usual Suspects. We had Sam Raimi, who was a legitimate director. We had Joss Whedon, at least scripting the Avengers.
And directing. But my counter to that is Marvel has no problem letting a director go, as noted by the third X-Men movie made by Brett Ratner.
Right.
Because it got to the point where the franchise will now make money. So let's lowball the director and move on to someone else.
But
Yeah,
those-
and effectively end this iteration of the franchise.
Yeah.
Because we're going to reboot anyway, right?
Of course.
Those are two very different approaches, though. I mean, with Marvel, you see a much more family-oriented approach, and with DC, you're seeing this focus on the director and bringing in a particular look and feel associated with a specific director,
Yeah,
and that's going to appeal to a different kind of audience.
that's true. The Batman films look like Christopher Nolan's films, right? There's
Yeah.
a similar color scheme, even
Yeah.
similar shooting techniques, editing styles, etc. Yeah. What do you make of this constant drive to reboot franchises? Is it pure money making, or is it something that actually fans enjoy, right? Because we have X-Men, which, yes, the third one sort of burned out that version of the franchise, and then they began over with a prequel that was a new sort of universe, right? And the same with The Amazing Spider-Man, which from 4 years after the third of the Sam Raimi trilogy ended, we now have 4 years, I think, right?
It's either 07 or 08.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe 5. Okay. That's a really fast turnaround. And if they're already plotting a new Batman, while The Dark Knight Rises is still in theaters everywhere.
Please see it if you haven't.
Yes, yeah. They need
But-
our support, obviously.
I think there's two things to remember with Spider-Man, the new Spider-Man movie and the new Superman movies. Both of those are being made for legal reasons to recapture rights.
That's true.
So there is a very specific motive there.
Yeah.
And I think you're starting to see a lot of lag in terms of response to reboots because everyone has seen a Superman origin story. We all know the origin of Spider-Man. the box office dollars show that everyone knows he gets bit by a spider. We don't need to tell that story anymore.
But the reboot is part of comics culture. There's that idea that you kind of retell the story in your own time, and that each generation kind of gets their version that's supposedly closer to something that's part of their life and their kind of visual references.
Sure. I mean, there's a vast difference, obviously, between the Adam West Batman to the Tim Burton Batmans to the Joel Schumacher Batmans, even to now Christopher Nolan's. But I mean, is there that much of a generational gap between the people who grew up on Spider-Man from 2002 and the people who saw the 2012 Spider-Man?
I think I'm thinking more about comics fans in general, the reboot culture within comics.
But even that's going by the wayside because the new 52 is terrible.
That's a different
For listeners
debate.
who might be not familiar.
So what DC did is they decided to end all of their current storylines and start over with 52 issue number ones, and it's been a terrible decision because all of the same problems have reemerged 1 year later.
But that's
Problems
also,
being multiple conflicting universes, right?
Too much lore, too much necessary back knowledge for new readers to get into.
But that's a very specific case. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very extreme case. I mean, DC decided basically to reboot everything
At the same time.
At the same time in their story universe, and usually this is something that goes on a particular, storylines that they just decide to start over.
And it's
Right.
usually not so much a full-fledged reboot, almost as like a recoloring. So like the Amazing Spider-Man still carries on, but we've also got Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yeah.
It's the same, but not really.
So fans
Parallel
would want-
versions of the same character, where this is a whole, everything before doesn't count anymore, right?
Yeah.
Correct. And many characters have been erased or radically changed.
Maybe in terms of superhero films, peculiar entries might be something like the second Hulk movie following Ang Lee's Hulk, which while financially successful wasn't considered to be an actual success. Got some critical praise, some ambivalence, some outright hatred, and they recasted Hulk and then started over. But it was still the same universe, sort of. And the same thing with the Superman Returns film from a few years ago. It was intended to be kind of, sort of, in the same universe as the first two Superman films, right? From Richard Donner. And,
Yeah.
well, he began work on the second one back in the early 80s, but I don't think he came... It was taken away from him by the studios. So there's a mythic Richard Donner cut that's available, right?
Yeah.
What do you make of these that try to have some continuity to older films, even if they're also essentially reboots? Reboots with continuity. It's an odd dynamic, right?
Well, the story with the newer Hulk film was that they felt that there'd been too much time between the Ang Lee film and the Avengers, and so they wanted to kind of refresh the character. I think the other idea was that the Ang Lee version of Hulk was seen as too much of a departure, and they wanted to kind of pull it back into the canon.
Also, it was not very good.
Well, that's debated. But
I just remember people defending it because Ang Lee used split screens to replicate the comic book panels.
I love that. I'm sorry.
It's
No,
tacky.
we have some disagreement here.
Yeah,
What?
it's tacky.
Why?
It's
Katie,
it's
you
cheap.
like it, Justin, you
I
don't.
thought it
So
was
so
cute.
what?
It's cheap. It looks so tacky.
I thought it was cute. We'll just keep on. We'll agree to disagree.
Katie, do you have other reasons why you referred that? I mean, Eric Bana was a pretty good Hulk.
I enjoyed that. I just, I thought it was. I appreciated.
Wasn't angry Nick Nolte the villain?
I can't
Yes.
remember anymore.
Yes. Angry Nick Nolte, angry father Nick Nolte,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
who got transformed into the non-corporeal electric storm. Nick Nolte. Yeah.
But Hulk
Yeah.
was part of the kind of master plan for the Avengers franchise. I mean, that new Hulk movie was part of that.
Yeah, we now have more
Right.
Hulks than Hulk movies.
Yes. Yes.
It's true, or do we? We have 3 Hulks and 3.
Nope, 2 Hulk movies.
Well, okay,
And then a Hulk TV show.
Yeah.
that's right. With many directed-TV films that were quite compelling, and did feature other Marvel characters like Thor and Daredevil. I'll defend those films as being wildly entertaining. Perhaps this is getting into a question, I think, of the trajectory of franchises, comic book franchises, that is. Like many franchises, there's often a law of diminishing returns that seems to be in effect, but not necessarily. So I'm wondering if we see patterns here, like first installments, second installments, and subsequent films. When talking about the Ang Lee Hulk, for instance, it's a problem that I feel is typical of many superhero films. Is the initial one? I actually am interested in the origins if it's done. So say Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins, to me, it was really interesting. until the inevitable conflict. I thought it would have been bolder to just be all training and no like real conflict, but that's not really marketable, I suppose. But it seems to me that the villains or the conflict in the first installment is never really compelling. It's always the introduction either succeeds or doesn't, and then there's a, rote fight or something that happens after that.
Well, because in that case, it's secondary. I mean, the real conflict is, the protagonist conflict with themselves. Will they take on the mantle? Will they become, the superhero we all know they're going to be? So it's almost like the tension is between them and the audience. We all know what's going to happen. We're kind of just waiting for them to accept the inevitable and get it done.
And I think that's a Nolan thing. I think that's something that he started where the first of your new sort of trilogy, you don't use the main villain. Because Tim Burton used Joker.
Right.
Yeah.
Nolan saves Joker for part 2 of his auteur vision. And you see that with the new Amazing Spider-Man. They don't use Doc Ock. They go with the Lizard.
Yes.
So it becomes sort of less about the villain with part 1 because you need to establish the hero and build the audience. And then you get the good villain in part 2.
Yeah. And the villains in those film franchises complicate the protagonist, right? Whereas in the first one, it's usually just another sort of training, another level of the training is to beat this, I don't know.
And they also start to multiply. Usually in the second and third installment, you start to get multiple villains because we need to up the action and up the conflict.
But does that cheapen the effect? I mean, the first that I recall, obviously in Superman 2, we have the 3 Kryptonites, but that's a sort of, they're a unit, so to speak, right? The 3 Kryptonians and rampant product placement, sort of, or the villains in Superman 2. But in Batman Returns, for instance, that's the first one that I really recall them spending multiple villains. And even Christopher Walken is essentially the sort of true villain of that film, is the evil capitalist. But he's not like a comic booky villain. But yeah, does that work for you too? To me, it sort of seems excessive, and it's...
And I think that's something they're getting away from with this new sort of last decade, where you're starting to sort of focus in. Like, that X-Men trilogy is all about Xavier versus Magneto for the most part. I mean, William Stryker stumbles in for a little bit, but really it's about that relationship.
There are philosophical differences.
Yeah.
And then, it was just Batman, Joker, and Dark Knight.
I have a confession to make, though. Ultimately, I usually like the origin story the best, and I usually hate all the movies after it.
Ooh, okay.
So I tend to, the moment we start moving away from that kind of taking on of the cowl or putting on the cape, I'm kind of done, usually. I don't care about the villains. Unless there's a compelling, something like some sort of personal conflict or interpersonal thing happening. I'm usually not interested.
So you're about the superhero coming of age, so to speak.
Yeah, I like the kind of psychological journey. I like that character kind of moment, and then after that, in terms of the films, I tend to find the rest of the films unsuccessful. So my pet theory has always been with superhero films, for me, that they're only successful as an origin story, and that the follow-ups for me tend to fail because they are no longer telling the origin story, and I'm not sure it works within film narrative, to move on from that. But you are looking at me like you want to disagree strongly.
Absolutely. The Dark Knight is awesome.
Yeah, I was totally disappointed by it.
I'm in the camp that I was enjoyable, but doesn't quite hold up. But
well, and I'm in the camp that Dark Knight Rises is better than the Dark Knight, because whoever the woman is in Batman Begins was not a compelling character in any sort of real way. She is empty, and I know it was played by Katie Holmes and replayed by Maggie Gyllenhaal, but that is not that's
the definition of tacked on subplot.
Yes.
Tacked on subplot and poor character motivation for a character who is better than that. And then you actually get to see real character motivation in a character worthy in Anne Hathaway in The Dark Knight Rises.
Oh, sure. So I like Dark Knight Rises. I don't think it really works as a story. I think it's more a story of it's a world with a lot of characters in it. But someone else said that, and I'm quoting him. I think it was Scott McCloud. But I mean, for me,
wait, can you repeat that quote then, real quickly?
I think it was Scott McCloud. He said that.
And Scott McCloud has published a classic book about understanding comics.
Several.
Well, yes, multiple.
But I think. What's the name of the third film? I can't remember.
Dark Knight Rises.
Thank you. So in Dark Knight Rises, he basically said that it was a story world with a lot of characters in it, but he didn't particularly see a plot, and I would agree with that.
Yeah.
In terms of the first film, I mean, for me, it's all about Bruce Wayne going through his training.
Yeah.
And going back to Gotham and becoming Batman, and that's what's most interesting to me.
That's very compelling. I mean, I think in hindsight that might be my favorite of the series as well. Actually, much to Justin's chagrin.
Dark Knight Rises is awesome. I will have that fight.
I love Maggie Gyllenhaal, but I just, ultimately in those films, the female characters tend to be very secondary to the male ones, and
Right.
they're just written that way, which is one of the reasons why I was interested in the most recent Avengers film, but because I didn't think that happened there.
So before we move on, I have a couple things for Katie, and maybe a lot that just come up in the last few comments here. First, so best told origins. I mean, I think Batman Begins probably takes it, but did you have others that you felt were particularly compelling, either of you?
First Class, X-Men First
Oh,
Class.
right.
I love that origin.
I hated it.
Oh wow.
We don't like anything together.
I actually really enjoyed the Captain America movie and the first Iron Man movie.
Why?
The origin story.
Why was First Class working for you, Justin? Why was Captain America and Iron Man working?
Because I like that pre-animosity relationship between Xavier and Magneto, and I like that it was also a period piece, and that's sort of, there's like I love the fact that superheroes are timeless, and they actually tried to capture that with First Class. And I'm with you that those.
And it speaks to the actual period in which X-Men began,
Yeah.
the '60s, right?
But those Marvel origins are really well done. There's nothing about them that is uncompelling.
Wolverine origins.
Okay,
Well.
that's not a movie.
But no, it's so about First Class. I loved the period aspect of it. I loved the look and feel. I thought it was handled unevenly, but I loved the idea of it. And I love the Xavier and Magneto kind of conflict. I just felt that ultimately the narrative arc failed for me because it was, to me, 2 to 3 films packed into one. And we didn't have that time to emotionally invest in the story, to follow the characters. And I wanted 2 to 3 more movies out of it.
You're gonna hate the sequel then.
Yeah, I'm not.
You're gonna
I'm
hate it.
Not feeling.
See, that's
good
an
about
issue I often have with these comic book movies. Is so much is compressed, and
Yeah.
I like slow.
So start reading. Stop.
I mean, if you think about it, this is an issue when you're going from the comic book medium, which is very serial and very kind of
Yeah.
segmented, to the film medium. I mean, there's a particular kind of narrative arc that
Yeah.
one demands that the other doesn't have.
Space and time is lost, and you
Yeah.
have to
True.
compress a lot of information into a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, these films are highly elliptical. The other thing with origins that I was curious about is, what about the first installments that aren't origins? I think of Tim Burton's Batman as being a great example. And to me, is honestly probably still my favorite Batman film. It starts with him already as Batman, and then we get a brief flashback to what caused him to become it, Batman, but we don't get any training, we don't get any of the logistical background that we do in Christopher Nolan of how he developed his technology and whatnot. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I can think of too many others. Perhaps the first X-Men, the Bryan Singer X-Men, is similar. We get some flashbacks that explain things, but we start, in the middle of them acting as superheroes. Does that work for you, Katie, Justin, as being an adequate starting point? Do you feel like the flashback is a cheap gimmick? I mean, I think it's kind of weak at times, but I often also think it's good not to just have to plow through exposition before we get to something happening.
Yeah, I mean, it works. I think we're going to have to start seeing more of that because I think origin stories are getting a little stilted and predictable. I mean, just look at the Green Lantern. I mean, I think there's going to become a shift to sort of starting in the middle of the action, and instead of even doing flashbacks, I think they'll find something else to convey this information.
Yeah.
Well, usually you get that kind of outsider or newcomer that they become
Right.
their eyes into the world. I'm trying to think.
Or we just get a Robin character that we can train, and that becomes the new origin
I have
story.
a soft spot for Robin, so that would make me happy. But I'm trying to think in the Burton Batman film, the first one. Do we have that?
Well, we do have reporters following
Okay.
Batman.
That's a way in.
Yeah. So that's sort of it, to some degree.
Yeah.
But then just the typical flashback to his parents being killed. Yeah.
And the confrontation with the guy who shot him. That
Yeah.
happens, I think,
Right.
eventually.
I mean, in terms of whether flashbacks are successful or not, I tend to like it more when it's kind of more a part of a kind of narrative pattern of moving forward and backwards in time, but that's just my particular preference. I like when a narrative kind of has a specific kind of scenario for how they're going to handle that, and it's not just a momentary kind of disruption. But I think that's subjective.
Yeah. You like the process.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. But it's interesting that you say that because I'm thinking about the new Avengers film. That was one of the things I found problematic about it. We start at so many different points and with so many different characters that it was hard for me to know how to feel about the story and who to invest in emotionally because we didn't have that sense of origin in the same way. They were trying to do...
Although if you did your duty as a
Yeah,
viewer, you should have
you
watched
saw
about
the
10
origin.
previous films.
But I mean, at the same time, that film still needs to stand on its own to some extent, and I had a hard time emotionally investing in it and feeling like it was really clicking together as a story because I didn't feel that sense of beginning.
Okay. It felt like an installment rather than the start of something.
It was also the way it started. I mean, you start with these secondary characters that you haven't really been introduced yet, and it just, for me, it was very abrupt. It's like, oh, we're having a chase scene. Okay, I guess I'm supposed to care about these people.
Yeah.
In that chase scene, there's only one new character.
Well, there's Hill and Hawkeye.
Okay, Hawkeye. But he's in Thor.
Oh, no, he is. I'm just saying that ultimately he's very kind of secondary to Thor.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
fans know who he is and care and are excited by
But
him.
It
well,
seems
I
like
think that's-
inevitably some of these heroes have to take a back seat to the other ones, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can't-
I just thought it was a lot to hang the opening chase scene on and a lot to introduce the film on.
Well, part of that is the origin of the Avengers, in that they don't exist when the movie starts, so they need some sort of impetus to actually put them together.
Yeah, I would have done it with a different set of characters. I would have gone with someone we already knew, personally. Because
Yeah.
I didn't have a sense of being compelled by the danger they were in. I was like, who are these people? Tell me more. And I'm saying this as someone who greatly enjoys Hawkeye. So,
And you did see all of the prior
and I
films.
did see all the prior films.
Okay.
And the shorts.
Yeah. You know, the Avengers, I think, talking about this collection of heroes, some of the commentary, at least some critics, were a bit skeptical or ambivalent towards the Black Widow character, right? Played by Scarlett Johansson. And this speaks to maybe a broader issue in these that you started to touch on earlier about women in these superhero films. There's often a love interest who's female, but when the superheroes are women themselves, do they get, short shrift? What about the superhero films featuring women such as Elektra or Catwoman with Halle Berry? It seems like they really botched these. And why is it that those seem to have poor production values, poor screenplays, poor directors? Is it just outright misogyny within the film industry? We have a really compelling, like, Catwoman Batman Returns, and, pretty compelling one in The Dark Knight Rises as well. But then the actual film about Catwoman is really awful. So, any thoughts on...
Can I ask a trick question?
Sure,
Oh, God.
yes.
So, just in a few words, what did you think of the Black Widow character in the Avengers movie?
I had no problems with her.
Do you think she had a presence in the film?
Oh, a presence. Well, everyone's playing like eighth fiddle to the Iron Man,
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Thor, and Captain America.
Yeah.
So her presence is mitigated by the fact that she is not Robert Downey Jr.
What did you think?
Well,
Adam?
that's true. Yeah, I'm in much the same camp, I suppose.
Well,
Yeah.
part of the reason why I'm asking is because there was this interesting debate online with a lot of comics bloggers. A lot of female comics bloggers said that they felt that she was central to the film, that she was integral to the
Ah.
plot, and she was a massive character in the film. And a lot of the critical reviews said that she was secondary, that she was a chick with a gun, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a kind of analysis done of this where it was argued that perhaps male film critics were just simply not noticing her presence in the film
Interesting.
or relegating her to a secondary role, whereas female audiences and other people who were really invested in the character read her character very differently. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on that. I just
Yeah.
thought it was an interesting difference.
Well, I can see where they can read that presence with the sort of integral role she has with freeing Hawkeye
Yeah.
and her role in that last hour of the movie actually doing stuff.
And the interrogation with
Yeah.
Loki too.
I mean, it's not that her role is not as important as the other heroes. It's just that she is standing behind them at all times. In all of the shots, she's in the background for the most part, except for when
Yeah.
Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America leave the scene.
So is this certain viewers, reading against the grain, so to speak, or is it actually that these critics are overlooking something important here?
Or it could just be, the reality of audience identification.
Yeah.
If you connect with a particular character, you may read their experience in a particular way, or you may not if you're not.
Whichever
connected to
character
them.
you're invested in,
Yeah.
you're going to be most attentive to.
Yeah.
Okay. fair enough.
But I do think, Justin, you bring up an interesting point when you talk about where she's positioned in the frame and things like that. I mean, I think that's something to go back and,
Yeah.
and look at and think
Visually,
about.
we're being told something about her.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, she's not Robert Downey Jr.
Yes.
But interestingly, they decided to minimize his role somewhat in the film. He wanted the film to be centered around him. And Joss Whedon and co. decided when they were writing the script that they were not going to do that. So that was a choice they made.
He's still in front of all the posters and things.
Oh, yeah. But
And he cashed a really big check.
But he could have been the through line in terms of the character that we followed and across the story and who kind of led
Yeah.
the troops.
Yeah, who is the through line in that movie?
Well, that's part of my problem. Yeah.
Because I wish it was Clark Gregg.
Oh, it should be. It should be. But he's maybe getting a TV show. A S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show. I don't know if you guys heard about
No,
that.
he's not. I read today it's all new characters.
Oh,
Ooh.
I'm totally bummed about that.
Yeah, it's all new.
I was really hoping
Yeah.
it would be a Phil Coulson
It's
S.H.I.E.L.D.
yeah,
TV show.
all new.
Yeah, getting into superheroes on television would be a whole big can of worms that I think we might best save for another episode. Maybe we can go back to this issue before moving on, just a minute or two, of, again, the trajectory of superhero franchises. And particularly, I mean, we can see this in, well, my predecessors to the current phase. The superhero films and the Batman films that began with Tim Burton go from, relatively serious-minded, kind of dark. The Tim Burton Batman films were considered dark at the time, and Odette to Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, to outright camp, right? By the end of the Superman cycle, he's flying around with Richard Pryor, and there's really poor production values. In Batman, we get the Joel Schumacher black light extravaganzas with
It's got
cod
nipples.
pieces and nipples on the bat costumes. And this is, even in these newer franchises, it kind of reproduces itself. The X-Men 3 is, just a kind of mess. But Spider-Man 3 is really camp. It's like pure and simple, undermining the whole rest of the franchise. Why does this happen? Why does it go from serious-minded to jokey? Even The Dark Knight Rises had the most quote-unquote jokes, right, in the whole franchise. We have Catwoman who says some witty things, and there's some humor here and there that was absent, I think, even with the Joker's presence in the previous film.
I think, though, with that trilogy, that Nolan trilogy, though, those things are all sort of character-driven, and I don't know what's going on with the third Spider-Man that makes it take such a ridiculous turn down this dark path to undermine an entire franchise.
I know that, if I remember it, they had a lot of strange things going on with the script for the Spider-Man.
Yeah, they had to cram
Yeah.
Venom in.
Yeah.
Which Sam Raimi did not want.
No, he wanted
There
to
was
tell a
contention
very
about
yes.
that. But I mean, for me, this goes back to my theory of why I think the origin stories work best as a film and why I think it falls apart after that. I mean, I think that
But
once you tell the origin story,
That's the theory, but what
But the
is it?
thing
Like,
is,
why
like-
do they fall apart? Is it that these narratives, these characters can't sustain seriousness unless you're Christopher Nolan for more than 4 hours or so?
Well, but the thing with that though is that some of the better ones are X-Men 2 and Spider-Man 2. Those are
Yes.
the go-tos of these are the movies that are great movies without being just superhero movies.
Yeah. I actually think X-Men 2 is the best comic book movie, but I'm not sure if I want to defend that right at the moment.
I don't know. I did not like Spider-Man 2, so I just don't. But I didn't like Spider-Man 1 either. I didn't like any of them.
Well, that's a podcast we can have just about that Spider-Man trilogy.
Well, you, Justin, are a second installment guy, right? If you're saying The Dark Knight is the one, X-Men 2, Spider-Man 2.
I'm just sort of jaded on origin stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get them every TV season. I get
That's
them.
fair.
They're not that different after a while.
So something about the familiarity with the characters that audiences don't have to be patronized with excessive exposition, unless you're Christopher Nolan, where people explain their meanings constantly. But there's a familiarity level that enables you to have a more engaging conflict, narrative, antagonist, perhaps.
Yeah, you can just get into stuff quicker, and part of what makes The Dark Knight so great is starting with the villain and all of the stuff with the villain, and the problems that a hero who thought he had everything figured out now doesn't, because chaos has appeared in his poor city.
So the first is all about establishing the stability of this character, and then we have to gradually undermine the stability of that character.
Well, specifically with Nolan, because it goes chaos and then pain with part 3. So you know, that's where I stand on that. Origin stories are cool, I
And then
guess.
European retirement.
Yeah.
I think, you're making me think too, there's something interesting about how the Nolan trilogy works as a 3-part story, that with a lot of the other films, they're not necessarily trying to work in that way. They tell the origin story, and then it's like, okay, now we're going to tell another kind of villain superhero conflict, and we'll do another one, and we'll do another one, and we'll add more villains because it'll make it more interesting. And I think that's where they lose me. But that's where, for me, Nolan might be more successful because the journey's kind of continuing.
It's a long form narrative.
And it might be creative cohesion between development team that
Yes,
Nolan
yes.
has that other people don't.
Yes.
Right.
Because Nolan can.
Yes.
I think that's a very good point.
Less studio interference. He makes big bucks, so he can do what he wants, right?
That might be something we could say
Is
possibly.
going to happen with Whedon and the Avengers.
Or just in general with their kind of plan has been kind of working to some extent because they have had a lot, Marvel has had a lot of control over how this franchise unfolds. I don't know if it's going to be able to be sustained, but I do think there's been a lot of consideration about how they do that, kind of seeding at the end of the movie, the next movie to come, and there has been a kind of continuity there that's been a little more level.
It's almost a large-scale version of the old film serials, right?
Yeah.
Where you'd go every week and see 10, 20 minutes of an installment. But except now, every couple of years, we have 2 hours to go see.
I think that's a great point, yeah.
And I think that's why they've called it their cinematic universe, because they want to note that there's a distinction between what goes on the comic books and what goes on the screen, and that there is a creative director behind this entire massive endeavor, and that's Josh Whedon.
Yeah. And I think, too, your earlier point about what's shifted since 2000, I mean, that could be something that's connected to that sense of needing to kind of create a continuity for there to be a flow from one film to the next. And maybe prior to that, they were seen as more segmented. And
Right.
we'll throw this one out there and we'll see what happens. And then, oh, it was successful, maybe we'll do it again, rather than really planning it out.
I mean, it's going along with those lines. Perhaps then this can get us into another issue that I want to talk about, which is the sort of rise of fan culture, or maybe it's not necessarily a new thing, but because of increased accessibility to communication technologies around the turn of the 21st century, more and more people have access to these online communities, and so perhaps there's a greater ability to be attentive to narrative developments, to the pre-production stages of these films, everything about them. Does that seem plausible, or is that...
Well, I think when you talk about fan culture, you talk about comic books, you have to start at Comic-Con, and you have to start in San Diego, which is every June or July. Massive thing that has just grown in popularity in the last 12 years because of superhero movies. People are going there to debut footage. I mean, Zack Snyder took 2.5 minutes of Superman and made a guy cry.
They're promotional events now on top of
Yeah.
being celebratory events.
But I think the other thing going on there is the shift in terms of production and marketing towards thinking about a mass audience to thinking about more niche audiences. And how do you make sure you have that guaranteed fan base in the room buying tickets that will guarantee you a certain amount of money versus just kind of throwing a film out there to a wide variety of people and hoping that lots of people will come.
So events like Comic-Con then reveal a target audience for these studios. They can say there are people who will pay, go see this film multiple times still. They'll support these franchises through numerous installments, where maybe it was perhaps uncertain in the past. I mean, this is pure speculation now because in my mind, there's only 2 major superhero franchises that were successful, Superman and Batman, before this kind of period.
Well, you've got, to some extent, you've got things like The Mask and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Those certainly have their origins in comic books, and this is something we were kind of debating before this episode tonight. In my mind, those films aren't marketed as comic book adaptations, even though they are comic book adaptations.
Yes. I think that's
particularly with Teenage
significant.
Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, the first film drew heavily on stories from the original comic book, but the film was made because the cartoon and the toy line were successful.
And that movie lost the darkness of the comic books.
Yes.
It did and it didn't. I mean, it was for a kids movie, it was very violent.
It was it was darker than the cartoon, but perhaps not as dark as the comic. But I think
the turtles swear. One of them gets beaten into a coma. I mean, that's
and
a rarity
visually
for a children's movie, I would
it's
say.
darker. But the thing I think that's different there is there's a kind of hiding of the fan audience while still depending on it in those earlier films.
Yeah.
And perhaps now it's more like, no, we embrace you, we want you to come.
We are catering
Because
to you.
I think, frankly, they're more dependent on them now than they were. I mean, movie ticket sales are down.
If we have them come 12
But
times,
not in superhero movies. Those are huge successes.
It's still this summer less people attended the movies than in the past. I mean, the
Yeah.
difference is more in ticket prices, really.
They still showed up for the Avengers
Sure.
and the Dark Knight Rises and Spider-Man. It's just they didn't see anything else.
Yeah, I mean but that's a key difference. Is now they're really dependent on
Yeah.
catering to that community that wants to see those films,
Mhm.
and they know they'll come even if they hate it, because the opening night is kind of the event that you go and do.
Yeah. You know, this sort of catering to a particular audience and just the sort of dominance, I would say, of these films, it also speaks to broader developments in maybe the film industry in general. And a few critics who I read online, A.O. Scott from the New York Times and Jim Emerson, who has a blog on Ebert's website, have been critical to some degree of these new films. And A.O. Scott was suggesting that around when Avengers came out, that it was a film in the tradition of, say, Rio Bravo, where you get these compelling characters together and they talk, and the conflict isn't really what makes the movie work, but the characters. And he also suggests that to some degree, the rise of the superhero movie has come about at a time, and this goes back to even the 70s when Superman was starting out, when the traditional heroic genres of Hollywood, the Western and the war movie, were in eclipse. But now, something about perhaps the ideology of these superhero movies works, or at least you can identify the market and that works. So that's one issue. The other is what seems to be the defensiveness of superhero fans. And I have a quote here from A.O. Scott that I'd just like to read, and let's see if we have anything to say about it. So earlier in the summer, he did a piece about superhero movies in general, and Scott wrote, "What the defensive fans fail or refuse to grasp is that they have won the argument. Far from being an underdog genre defended by a scrappy band of cultural renegades, the superhero spectacle represents a staggering concentration of commercial, corporate power. The ideology supporting this power is a familiar kind of disingenuous populism. The studios are just giving the people what they want. Foolproof evidence can be found in the box office returns, $1 billion. Who can argue with that? Nobody really does." So, with these films, people obviously love them. People flock to them. Comic book fans and probably more so non-comic book fans are what's making this successful. So is this, as Scott calls it, some sort of disingenuous populism in that they're catering to comic book culture and just really exploiting the reliability of those groups to come again and again and again to numerous installments within franchises, numerous reboots of franchises? Or is it actually giving fans what they want to see on the big screen, that their beloved comic book narratives and heroes and characters writ large? Thoughts?
Well, I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because if they make a bad movie, people aren't going to see it. I mean, something like Green Lantern is terrible and it didn't do well.
And that one doesn't work. I mean, it's excessive CGI for one, but what else about it failed?
Poor character development, no villain, I guess. I don't know. It's a giant cloud. Cool.
Yeah. And the same sort of maybe online cultures that can create a film's buzz, can also ruin it ahead of time, right?
Yes,
you hear
yes.
awful things about Green Lantern, and then it dies.
But the other question to ask about Green Lantern, and I don't fully have the answer to this, but I think it's just important to think about, is, Green Lantern may have failed within the U.S., but how did it do globally?
True.
Did it make its money back? Because those are ultimately the larger concerns. It's not about whether we like
But for
it.
these films, remember, just recouping expenses isn't success for the studios. I mean, I'm sure it made more than that, but it needs to make several times more than the expenses in order for it to be considered quote-unquote successful.
Yeah, and it was a thing that they said about Green Lantern, that if they don't make a sequel, there's no way for it to become profitable because of all the CGI that they had to develop to even make it feasible.
Interesting. So they may wind up making a sequel.
Yeah.
But I think, if we think about the new Iron Man film that's being made right now, that's being produced in China and has Chinese backers behind it, I mean, I think that kind of talks about how global this business is, and how much this is about much more than films in America. I mean, these films are also about promoting comic books, about cartoons, about selling toys, about selling pajamas. This is part of a much broader array of products than just the films themselves.
And many of those elements were already in place, but now it's just, to the nth degree. There's so many more marketing opportunities, perhaps.
Yeah.
Possibly. I don't know. What about the defensive fans, the ones who flock to IMDb, to the Rotten Tomatoes comments boards, who send nasty tweets to critics? This seems new. I mean, perhaps there were letter writing campaigns in the past, but
Yeah.
but how do we get people who push some of these films to the highest ratings? You know, last week we talked about the Sight and Sound top 10 list of films. You know, nary a superhero film to be seen. But if you go to Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb, they're up there. The Dark Knight in particular is the best movie ever. Justin, give us 2 thumbs up.
I don't know, because there was that weird moment this summer when people were giving negative reviews of Dark Knight Rises. Again, it's a kind of a mess. It's all over the place. It's still awesome. Don't get me wrong. But people were like writing terrible things on the comment board, so Rotten Tomatoes had to shut down the comment board.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of like there needs to be a distinction between the cinematic universe and the real one that is not happening right now.
But I think ultimately, I don't know that the sentiments and the kind of passion is a new thing. I think it's the technology that enables people to feel like they can post and share their opinion, and
it's real easy to burn a letter.
Yeah,
Sure.
and I mean, and trolling culture to some extent has a certain.
Well, even
place in
Samuel
this.
Jackson tweeted at A.O. Scott for what was actually a pretty positive review of The Avengers, but it wasn't, overwhelmingly positive. Not positive enough, I suppose.
And we're also in a kind of time when people's socializing can become news. So the fact that Samuel Jackson tweets something can become in itself a news story that populates blogs, that gets them advertising sales, that kind of continues a certain social media business. So the fact that that in itself is kind of a news event is part of the business of the moment too, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
So if we want to be a conspiracy theorist, we could say the studio encouraged Samuel L. Jackson to respond.
Who knows? But you were talking earlier, you said something about it being the moment of the fan, and the one thing I would say is I think it's the moment of a particular fan audience. I think
Yes, let's make this distinction.
So think about what just happened with the DC reboot. A lot of people have argued that part of what happened with the DC reboot is DC made, and people could counter-argue this too, but that DC made a choice to refocus on male fans, and specifically to kind of cut out certain female characters in a way to kind of push that audience away. Now that's a controversial statement, and other people would argue with me.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that the movie industry is still primarily focusing on male audiences, and has this theory that if they make the movies about girl characters, for example, like the female characters that we've seen, and they're not heavily sexualized or targeting men, that somehow people aren't going to go to them. I don't know that that's true, but I think it's important to keep in mind. That's
a good point. And we don't even see some of the prominent female filmmakers, like Catherine Bigelow seemed like she would make a great comic book movie, most likely. But that she doesn't want to, or is not getting, pitches sent to her way.
Yeah. Or, for example, after this new Avengers film, I know all the fangirls online were rallying for a Black Widow movie. And, instead everyone's mad because we're getting an Ant-Man film instead. But, I mean, those kind of decisions speak to who the films are being made for and directed to.
And made by.
Yes, absolutely. And the fact that they now have ensemble casts, is a way of trying to kind of broaden the characters in the film, but it's not particularly shifting the protagonist too much.
We're going to get a space raccoon before we get a Black Widow movie. Keep it on alert. Guardians of the Galaxy, guys. Space raccoon.
That makes
2014.
Me kind of excited. I want to see a space
Potentially,
raccoon.
right?
No, it's coming. 2014.
It's coming.
James Gunn.
Okay.
Everybody watch out. There's a talking tree, too.
I like talking trees and raccoons, but I'll stop with that.
I think perhaps one other franchise we haven't really dealt with is a clear-cut comic book franchise that predates X-Men, but is also in that weird period between the Joel Schumacher phase and the contemporary, and that's Blade began in the late 90s, which was another Marvel product, and that was a relatively successful franchise. But I think I don't know if it's my impression or just that this is the general way people think about it. It's set apart from the rest of these comic book movies as being something different, and I'm curious if that is something you two register as well.
I do. I don't put it in that canon quickly, but maybe I should because of Guillermo del Toro's presence in the franchise. I mean,
we're not talking about Hellboy
at
either.
all. Yeah,
right.
We are also not talking about the film that I just thought of and I'm now immediately blanking on. Come back to me in 5 minutes. But I think Hellboy is really important to think about in terms of money.
Right.
And that kind of blending of fantasy and the kind of superhero.
And those films owed something to Guillermo del Toro's sort of
Vision,
prestige.
yeah.
I mean, he's another auteurist director who's made some comic book films. I mean, with Blade, I guess the reason I was thinking of it is the same reasons that we're talking about these female comic book heroes. And is there something exclusionary going on where when we have an African American hero who's the protagonist, those films aren't considered part of the same universe? Or is it because Blade is from the sort of horror subcategory of the Marvel universe? And I'm not sure if there's a clear answer that we can come to, but this is just a
I mean, I think that's something
consideration.
that movie producers struggle with. They struggle with moving beyond the white male protagonist in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I don't
particularly
Have
in
you
comic
seen
books.
the cast of the Avengers?
The
Yeah.
film I was thinking of that was
And
blanking
significantly,
on.
they recasted, or they cast Nick Cage as Samuel L. Jackson when in the comic books he was not African American, I don't believe.
No,
right?
no, he is.
In Ultimate Avengers,
Yeah.
they specifically say that Nick Fury looks exactly like Samuel L. Jackson.
There's
Oh
different
yes, and I
versions.
said Nick
of,
Cage. Sorry.
There's different versions of Nick Fury.
Yeah.
Okay.
The film I was thinking of that we were forgetting was Watchmen.
Oh right, yeah.
That's a good one to forget.
Well, I mean, but it was attempted to be a huge kind of event that would
Yeah.
perhaps launch another franchise, and it just didn't necessarily work.
Was it an attempt to launch a franchise?
I don't see
thought it was.
No, I don't think it was. I don't think it was an attempt to launch a franchise. I think it was an attempt to. It was definitely attempted to be an event.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was going to be a big deal. They wanted it to be huge. They wanted it. We are taking the holy grail of the comic book universe, and we're giving it to you as a movie. Oh,
Yes.
here it is.
And again, attempting for that more artistic kind of
Yeah.
approach.
But and Zack Snyder nailed it on the head when he talked about this movie. I made a 3-hour art film that no one likes.
well, I don't think I
Sure.
don't like a lot of Zack Snyder films, so I wasn't surprised by that.
Yeah, it's kind of not surprising to me that it didn't take off. It wasn't going to please anyone. You can't
Absolutely not.
You can't make Watchmen into a mainstream film. You can't please everyone who loves the graphic novel. Yeah, it seemed doomed from the start, but it might be actually the best possible version you might get from a mainstream studio. Perhaps. Perhaps not.
Fortunately, we didn't get the ones from the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have some of these other exceptions to the rule. Things that are superhero movies, comic book adaptations, but not the iconic heroes. So what do you make of those? Like Hellboy, as you bring up, its success, or
I kind of
else?
jumped to Dick Tracy.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
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 Gotta love the 4-panel spread in the newspaper. I love that movie. I think those are.
Did Dick Tracy, did the radio serial predate the comic strip, or vice versa?
I don't know. I don't know anything about radio serials at all.
Because I know that it was both at one
Yeah.
point. So so that'd be
I-
another interesting point that's undermining my initial.
I have a suspicion that the radio show came first,
Yeah.
but I don't have anything to back that up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that is interesting, and that was also another film that was considered not successful, correct?
Well, the first one was.
There's only one.
Yeah. Okay.
Although there's
It's sort of in a
always-
gray area of whether
Yeah.
it's good or successful or not. I
Yeah.
think it's great, but
I thought, I mean, because it had Madonna and Warren Beatty, and I remember it being a big deal when I was little. But I mean, that's just me remembering as a kid.
Yeah, I remember being excited about it.
It's interesting though, because there's a bunch of those kind of nostalgia films, nostalgic superhero films. There's that one. There's Phantom.
Oh, yeah.
And Phantom was also accompanied by an
The Shadow.
animated series. There was
Another
The
radio
Shadow.
serial adaptation.
Yeah, and they all happened around the same time, ish.
Yeah, that.
I'm gonna say The Tick.
The Tick. Oh, I
So
love the
that's a
Tick.
strange thing. We have that. We also had was the Spirit, a Val Kilmer thing? Wasn't that an old like comic book or
The
radio serial?
Spirit?
Yeah.
The-
Spirit, that wasn't Val Kilmer.
That was not Val Kilmer.
It
That was
was-
There was
Gabriel Mock.
Gabriel
There was
Mock.
one with Val Kilmer. That was a similar as like The Shadow from that era.
The Shadow was, yeah.
That was Alec Baldwin. But regardless, we see in the 90s then, after the first couple Batmans do well, then we get these weirdo kind of adaptations for a long time, and Batman develops in the camp. So this gets back to my earlier point, like, 90s something strange happened, and then there's this resurgence. And is it fan culture? We talked about potentially some ideological reason for these sorts of films coming back around?
For me, I think it's smart directors making smart films, and
Yeah.
at a time in which there was a gap in the market, because it was Bryan Singer. I mean,
Uh-huh.
the guy made a great movie with X-Men, and there's sort of something to be said for being able to get the right creative people in place to make a text.
So more care before, more care in just developing these properties, right, is part of the issue. We're going to give it to people who are talented.
But I also think it's a moment where movie attendance was dropping, where people's attentions were shifting to multiple forms of entertainment, and where this kind of movie could come in and really provide seats and chairs.
Big
Yeah.
spectacle.
Yeah.
So a convergence of care about the development, a marketplace in which these films would do really well, and maybe possibly something ideological in there, which we unfortunately don't have time to today. But in the sequel to this, which I'm sure will happen, we certainly can get around to some of those concerns. Any last thoughts before we finish up here? All right. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of The Pictures Get Smaller on River West Radio. Thanks to Justin and Katie for participating, and we'll be back next week with an episode about cult films and cult culture.